I come in a little late, but the main point about qualitative coding overview is to document and justify everything after you read a ton. Ready, go.
There was a point in one of the meetings, maybe like record any meetings you're having while you're doing your calibration, and then even going forward if you're discussing things. Have you ever done that?
I haven't, because this will surprise you considering how much I've been talking. The sound of my own voice creeps me out. So I don't, but I will say the other thing, I study group interactions. So I'm coding as I interact with people all the time. It's the absolute worst. What I would recommend is actually, I do know a lot of people that use something like Otter AI, which will actually transcribe the meeting for you, skip those steps. But then, of course, if it doesn't get it in audio, but to me, that's one more thing to lose. But that's why you have to have what works best for you and those kind of things, and have that kind of upfront. Again, where it gets tricky is like, that's extra data and REB and like, where's it saved? And I don't think, I mean, because again, it's members of the team, but those are all just kind of things to think about. I don't, because I don't think I would go back and listen to them. That's just me. So that's why you have to kind of figure out what works best for you. And when you're working on, like, the more you do this and the more practices, you're like, this is what I do. And you're working with somebody else who's like, this is what I do, but it's different. Then you get into what I like to call job security, socio-emotional challenges, and working in groups and negotiation and these kind of things. That's what I study, in case, okay. So that is a great thing. Thank you for bringing that up, because I do know some people will do that with Otter AI. They'll do every single meeting transcribed. I mean, it's online, it's for, sure, that's a lot of data that I will not look through. So if you've got the storage, why not? So document and justify everything. Make sure, and this is something that's really important, make sure that all the coders are knowledgeable and on the same page before starting. You know, when you have a straightforward code book, and so I was trained on, it still wasn't straightforward, but I had to read a lot. And so this is in grad school, I had to read a lot. I had to practice and read more. Yeah, it's the kind of the theme. But then I created my own code book. It's in there, I got it. It makes perfect sense to me. And sometimes that's hard for me to remember that, like, not everyone's read all the stuff that I wrote. Like, why would you? It's even more long-winded than I am. No, you should, it's good. Yeah. But that's where you have to make sure, kind of like, not only the training, but you're on the same page, and that everyone kind of has the same background and things like that. So yes.
I'm gonna interrupt you here.
No.
Because this fall, I went in as like a coder who really didn't know what was going on, but kind of knew what was going on. And there seemed to be benefits and cons, because I was able to find some things that they hadn't seen, because they were thinking so, they had been so used to thinking in line with the theories they were using. And I was coming in and I was like, does this kind of count? And they were like, oh, I guess it could. Like, it was just a little bit of a different. So how often do you try and like manage that? Like, that you want them to be, you want them to know what's going on, but you also want them to sense that you might not fit into that exact.
So follow up. You were seeing things that they didn't see while coding or during analysis? Interesting. So I think, to me, it's one of those, so the question was kind of like the pros and cons of like not being so narrowly focused. And so that's, again, why I use my other code and why I allow for new things. And I think that, to me, is one of the biggest pitfalls with deductive coding, is fitting things where they shouldn't be fit. And so I would even argue that to be able to see outside that means you know not only that literature well, but you also know like other things, and you can apply, you can bring in from outside sources and those kind of things. So part of knowing the literature is also knowing what's missing, and to bring in other perspectives. And that's why calibration is so very important. And like, maybe we do need an other code. Maybe there isn't, it doesn't always fit, because most codes are developed for this context. And unless you're doing like a, oh, what's it called? Like you're repeating it and you're trying to do the same thing, I would argue it's still with different people. So, yes, thank you. Thank you. Replication study. The codes might not always fit. And again, we're still learning new things as we, new paper. I mean, if everything was set in stone, then why are we here, right? So I think that's part of that kind of why I do the mixed coding is, and I have seen people like they try to fit it in a place that doesn't make sense. And I'm like, well, let's make a new code if it needed to, right? Or change the way that we're defining this code to be more broad. Is there another? So then start in small chunks. Again, this is something that, okay, calibration on our fake data or on the data that we're not using went great. Let's just code the whole thing and then we'll circle back and the iterator, I'm sure, will be great. No, don't do that. So this is something that you'll see on ours. We did 20%. Why 20? I don't know. It's a good number to start with. We'll do like 20%, especially how smooth did calibration go? Yeah, we got to 80 or we got to 70, but it was a rocky. So let's do some. Let's do enough with different variations. So on ours, we did 20% of each scenario, which was 4 out of 20. And so then we iterated and we made sure we were still on the right track. Now, technically, that goes into our total iterator, right? But that's why the calibration got us to, where we needed to be. But we're going to start in small chunks. And there needs to be a clear plan and communication, right? What we don't want is one person doing all of the coding. And the communication that's between coding, that's during coding. Again, there are times I've been in one, I'm like, I know it's this, and you're just so tired at the end, and you see all the discrepancies, and you got to talk through them, and you're just like, just, it's me, it's what I put, just do it. So these are all kind of things to think about, is that coding is tough, but iterating is even harder, but the analysis is the worst, so. Writing's, it's all, no, I love every second of it. So let's go back to our, the diagram. So now we're ready to code, and now we're ready to apply the final code book. Again, starting with smaller sections and applying those codes. You don't have to code everything at once, and by everything I mean the codes. So if you have, so for example, on mine, I'm coding, there were 5 steps. I know this well enough that I can code all, I think there's actually only 4 to code. I can code all 4 of those at the same time and not get them confused. The first time somebody is coding this with less knowledge than the person who made the code book and wrote the theory probably will need to do it in smaller steps in order to do it reliably. Because it's a lot to keep track straight in your head, right? And so that's why that communication, you need to have a clear plan. So it could be that I'm going to do my 20%. So you can see, spoiler alert, here's my coding. So it could be that we code all the person ones first. Now, again, we've already color coded, so this one's easy. I just go down. Oh, no, that's purple. Oh, there's a blue one. So we code all of the blue ones first. Then green. Oh, gotta love color coding. I seriously apologize. I'm so sorry if anyone is colorblind. Didn't think about that. I do apologize in advance. Or in, not in advance. So then I code the ones and then these get none, right? So it's one step at a time. Now, the orange ones are all kind of connected. So maybe I want to do all of those at the same time. Then the purple one, or maybe I want to do the purple ones pretty straightforward and do that. So again, you just need to kind of have a clear plan of what makes sense. Because you don't want to do all this work and then set a time to come together and iterate. And one of you coded one thing and one of you coded another, which is fine. You're just going to have to schedule another meeting. Does that make sense of what I'm saying, of breaking it down? Now, again, and this is when I was training my students very poorly, we split these up. And it just didn't make sense because this says interpersonal, right? And this says interpersonal. But you see how this says interpersonal and this says cognitive, because we had two different people doing it. And there's no consistency across that. So that's why we really need the same, kind of people doing these codes and looking at it more comprehensively. But this is a lot for someone who's doing this for the first time. Yeah, you should all thank my 4 students who I worked out all the mistakes on them. So I'm actually kind of making sense now. So again, we started with 20%, 4 from each scenario. So the next ones are to make notes about the context, interpretations, and emergent codes. This is what one of my go-to, my qualitative Bible, if you will, is Saldana. I have the 2016. I think there's a 2021. It's like guide for qualitative research. It's on the last page of this slide. And he talks very deeply about analytic memos. But as you're making these as you're seeing these things, they can be about the codes, right? So, you can continue to say, I don't know about this, but you can also say, I'm starting to see a lot of interpersonal codes here, or I'm starting to see a lot of these things. And those are really what you're going to be basing your analyses, at least diving in up front. So everyone thinks that you do these like I code and then I analyze. And those people that don't start to do these analytic memos, when they get to the analysis stage, they're like, what do I do? What's happening? It's really, this is the most important thing, is these analytic memos throughout the coding process. And then, so one of the things that we started to notice was that for communication, that many of them were like, their response to a challenging communication scenario, which was like feedback, right? So one of them is like, your group is bad at giving feedback. They only criticize. They never, say anything constructive. Most of the responses were like, I would talk with the group. They wouldn't really, but they said they would. And so their strategy is to confront the group and discuss the issue together. So that was their strategy for overcoming this obstacle. Again, whether or not they'd actually do it is a whole other thing. But we noticed that on, again, the majority of them. So we're starting to notice this similar strategy that, wait for it, this is revolutionary. For communication issues, their answer is to communicate more or better. Revolutionary, like I said. And so then again, you want to iterate in chunks. Again, starting small, aiming for 80%, and then reconcile until 100% agreement. And so here, this is an option I use for my dissertation. If you've ever heard me talk about coding my dissertation, you've heard me say this. At this point, you know what? I did it, so I'm gonna brag about it. I coded 27,000 talk turns for my dissertation. 0 out of 10 stars, would not recommend. But so what we did to make that more manageable is that we coded, I think it was like 20% or whatever. We made the justification. We had very high inter-rater reliability, because this is another person who studied the exact same thing. We're very much on the same page. And what we did was we moved to a one coder, which was me, and an auditor if needed. And the inter-rater was high enough. So we had a very high inter-rater reliability at like 90%. Which is very, very high. And then so what I did was I coded the rest of, again, we took a representative sample, and I coded the rest of them. And then she went through and audited all of my codes. So she went through and said, yes, no, you missed this, or I would have called it that, or that, and so on. And that was also really high. Because it got to the point with when it's that high, the inter-rater, do we need to continue these meetings where we're just having these really high things, And as long as they're both, we also could have split it half and half, but it was my dissertation. She did something similar for hers on motivation. But again, what happens if I go to publish this, or what happens if my dissertation committee was like, nah, I can't I mean, I guess I could technically go back and redo it, but that's not happening, right? So again, you have to justify these decisions. With a 90% iterator, I could justify this. And I specifically decide the 20%, I said we did one from each group. There were 3 groups, one from each group. And then we did the beginning, I think the end, because there's different, the theory says that those should be different things. And then, yeah, it passed, I'm here. So then for the press, to be honest, when we did this, it was not great, because all the things I said you should do, I did not do. I want to reiterate, and I talked to them this morning, like, I do not blame them for any of this. I didn't do all the things I needed to do, and things just weren't clear. So it was here, the the calibration on the fake codes went well. But then when we got into the real data, it was like, oh no. And so this showed us that we actually needed to stop and go back, which is where we're currently at, and redo some things and recalibrate and change our processes, which I won't detail anymore. Not fun, but that's one of the drawbacks of using that fake data. And so then we update the code book. So we add in the details during every iterator meeting. Again, from the analytic memos, good examples. I actually, when I use Max QDA, I made a new code that says use example. And so whenever there was one, I was like, I'm gonna wanna put this in my manuscript. I would code it with like the ones I was like, this is it. I would code it, and so then you can search by code, and then it would pull out like, here are all the codes for you. So you're not gonna be like, at one point they said this thing, I think, help your, past Nikki is not nice to present and future Nikki. She sets me up for failure a lot. She puts me in tough situations. So do yourself a favor, help your future self out by doing the work during it, right? Make these notes, highlight, tag the good examples, tag the issues that need to be discussed, because it's all gonna run together. Here's the big one. Adding new codes means that you need to recode everything. So that if you are in the next to last sentence of the last transcript and you're like, ooh, I see something. Are you sure you didn't catch it before? Again, the name of this workshop is systematic. Because you can do listen, you can do, it's like, can I do this? Sure. Should you? So if I'm adding new codes, that really means I should be recoding all, which is why inductive coding is really tough and why I avoid it. So what I like to do, and I did this, there's a whole paper where I coded for strategies, because the literature, there's not a lot of strategies for group level emotion regulation codes. I was like, I don't have a list to even begin with. So what I did was I created a strategy code or an other code. And every time I saw something, they're using a strategy, I would just put that code on there. And then at the end, I looked at them all together and I gave them a name of what they were doing. I described what they were doing, again, based off my understanding of the literature. And then I did some code mapping, which there's a video on my website from last semester on code mapping. And so the strategies that I use now, like at one point, were inductive. But they were inductive from that one population. So what we're finding is that list is not comprehensive for here. That was a very kind of specific setting. And so I need that other code. So if I see something else, like I know it's different, I know it's new, what I like to do is put the other on there. Instead of creating a new code, I like to put other, and then at the end, I look at all the others together. And I say, because up here I might have called it, I don't know, taking a break. And down here, I might have said, walking around for 15 minutes. It's two things that are like the same thing, but then I'm like, well, are they, so this way I put them all in there and I go through code mapping. And that in itself to me is a finding of like, I'm advancing the research of like, what is in this space? What are these new codes? Why are they different? Why are they important to capture? So that's my recommendation when you're doing mix, is to have that other. I think to me, it also helps code. And now technically, again, you should go back and recode everything. But so anyway, that's my recommendation. And so when we did this, we updated it, we realized that we needed to condense some coding. We had it way too spread out. And then we needed to distinguish, there were two things that were just getting overlapping and kind of a mess. And then we really needed to pull those apart and explain those a little bit better. So, any questions on coding? Easy, done, next.
I have a question actually.
Go ahead.
I was wondering, if you have two coders, do you need an auditor to look over or not?
So usually what I do is one of the coders will become the second auditor, if that's the way
Okay.
that we move into. Set two coders, no, you do not. The auditor, the auditor could be technically, I guess, like peer debriefing of like, hey, let me see what y'all are doing. But you don't, to me, the auditor only comes in when you decide to go down to one, but you still want to add that
Okay.
reliability. But again, you have to, this is one of those things of like, you have to make an excellent case. I know some of you are like, yes, no double coding, let's audit all day. But it is one thing that you want to make sure. And so it's easy when you're doing your dissertation. I had to go to my committee and say, hey, can I do this? And they said yes or no. But now it's like, I can't go to a journal I want to publish in and say, hey, can I do this? I could, they wouldn't answer until it's after the fact. And so then I'm like, well, do I go back? That's why I document everything. And this might be like, hey, you go to a peer and say, can I convince you that this was a good idea? Is there a?
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Going after that, like initial iterate, like the IR gets lower than 80, if it's lower than 80%.
Again, so if that's a great question. What happens if the iterator reliability is lower than 80? I'm here to tell you, probably will be. So let's normalize that right now. So the first thing I would do, again, you're reconciling until 100%, which is also hard when you're using, so for example, if you're coding for your dissertation, and you have a second coder, there's a power dynamic too. It's not in here, and I'm just remembering this, of so too, when I train my students to code on mine, it's very important that I'm not the expert, the code book is the expert, right? Everything should be what the code book says. And so that's kind of really important to think about as you're reaching these agreements. So if I got one that's 80% or lower than 80%, again, you're marking it all, you're documenting everything. Then I would ask myself, do we need to go back and revisit? So, it could be that I was marking it this way, you were marking it this way. We've decided from now on to do it your way or to do a blended way. And that's why we don't do them all at once. So, we fix it and then we're like, do we need to calibrate? Do we need to go over this? Or no, we think we fixed it, and then we just keep moving on. So then maybe I do another 20%. And then it should get higher. If it's not, something's wrong. But again, the 20% of the data, 120% can be easy, another could be, so that's where you got to be careful. But the iterator, the goal is for the total overall to be at 80%. So you might start below that and you might end up higher. And again, I've published with higher than 70, but lower than 80. 80 is always just a good number to shoot for. And I am so sorry I don't have the citation for who said, if that's your question of who is this, why 80%? Who is this person that decided it? If you Google it, I'm sure you can find it, but off the top of my head.
I I don't totally understand what you were saying about using the other code and how that potentially prevents having to go through and recode, because from what I'm understanding, if you have the other code and then you see all the different sort of ways that other code manifested, then couldn't those then materialize into other codes that you would then have to go back and recode?
That was a lot. No, I love qualitative coding. So and again, this is what works for me and my data sets, is that you don't just call it other, you do have to go back at the end. So I use the other code instead of saying, like when I see something and I'm like, oh, I'm gonna code this taking a break. And I'm like, oh, they're taking a break, that's the strategy. And I was like, that wasn't on my list, I'm gonna call it taking a break. If I add that code in there, I really should go back to all the other stuff I've coded versus coded for taking a break, and then I'll continue coding forward for instances of taking a break. Whereas the other is basically like, and again, this is where my data is, we're asking them, what is the strategy you're using? So it's easier of like, if it's not on the list, I'm gonna call it other. And at the end, I'm gonna put them all together and make sense of them all together, rather than fitting them into a box early. So it could be like taking a break, but I might want to change that to disengagement based on the theory, and then put both of those in disengagement, or I might not, depending on that. But this data is much more structured in that way. So when I'm coding a collaborative learning group, you have to know, like, again, that's why the Freckle model, it's like, you don't start with the strategy, you start with the emotional expression of like, they're experiencing emotions. And then do they do anything about it, yes or no? So if they did anything about it, then I'd put strategy. If they didn't, I wouldn't. So the other code has its pluses and minuses, but that's just one suggestion that I do. Does that make sense? And then online, there's a question about analytic memos. So you did not miss it. I kind of talk about it generically because they are. So the exam is really just anything that you start to notice. The analytic memos are your memos that will help with the analyses, right? So when you start to see these patterns, write it down. They can take any form that you want. They can be as incoherent as you want. You can have as many as you want. But it really is just like making notes of the things that you see, of the coding thing, et cetera, et cetera. Really, there's not a structure involved. It's just more of like, this is why you do it rather than how. That's not the best example or best explanation. All right, let me keep moving. So then we're done coding. Yeah, right, never. Is to prepare data for analyses. So this is where you start to identify these noteworthy patterns and relationships among codes. So this is where you compile analytic memos. You can use the software that you're using to code to detect relationships. For those people that just like want to quantify whatever, do you? And again, this is that software thing varies so much based off what you're using. But this is where you start to find these patterns. And so for us, one of the things we did was start to in Excel is to filter and sort by strategy. So we're seeing like, even just clicking the filter button will show you the list of, why am I talking abstractly, Nikki? So here, if I go to my strategy and I hit filter, this will show me all the different options that I have, right? And these were open-ended, so they're gonna be more. But I can start to get a better sense of all the different strategies. And then I can say, okay, let's look at the interpersonal ones. And so I can filter out all and then I can just see like, what are these, I can start to make comparisons of like, the two that use interpersonal are the 2 or 3 that had strategies. I randomly picked these, so that's not true. Or they also targeted this specifically, or that, I can start to use that. I mean, Excel's pretty rudimentary when it comes to this. Some of the, like Max QDA will like do some really cool stuff. But this is just one example of how I want to start to look, again, based off of what my questions are. Yeah.
You can also make a table based on that if you turn it into a pivot table.
The pivot table, yeah.
Pivot chart, it's really,
Yeah.
Excel for that.
Yeah, so yeah, sorry. The pivot table, it's not my favorite. I've used it before, and I think it's one of those, I don't know why I dislike it, but it's much better than what I'm doing now. Yes.
It has some issues for sure, like it's very, you have to have the exact formula and everything.
Right.
You can't play around with it too much.
So the pivot tables are, I think what I've seen Max QDA and some of the other ones do is similar to what a pivot table is, but it's like you push a button and it'll say, yeah. Yes. My love for Excel goes only so far. It's pretty deep, but
Can I just ask what a pivot table is? I don't know.
yeah.
You turn so the list she just showed you, you could like copy that whole column and then take it into a new tab, for example, and then turn it into a table. So, and then you say my table has headers, and then you turn it into a pivot table. So yeah, you can look up. There's some. I learned about it from a workshop actually from Miguel.
It does. Pivot tables do a lot of frequencies. Yeah.
You can list it by frequency,
Yeah.
or you can list it in any
Right.
variable.
Well, and again, that's an excellent point, because the example I showed was like tiny, So if I'm looking at the whole thing, yeah, something like that, something more systematic, I'm going to need. Yes.
Have like a chart.
Right. Perfect. So be on the lookout for the unexpected. So there's a lot of, we focus on these patterns, but the contradictions are also really important. So look for the exceptions, the tensions, and the contradictions. So these unusual cases can be quite informative, and especially in our research question, that's kind of what we're looking for. So one of the things that we did, for example, is to look at differences in the appraisals of the common appraisals for those that led to common strategies versus uncommon strategies. So the communication one, some of the appraisals were like, well, everybody in the group matters, so we'll have a group conversation. Whereas one of the strategies that was basically just ignore the problem was like, we are adults and we have to do the job, not be friends. Like those are different again, we're not here to judge, but you see those different personalities come out, and that's exactly what we're looking for, is why people respond to these challenges differently, not just how they respond. And so the last little one, I promise, is to interpret the data in light of the research problem and questions. So you're interpreting the data for research questions. So you're trying to explain the patterns and relationships using the theoretical framework. Now, I have ADHD. This is who I am. It's part of me. I love coding and I love analysis, but there's so many shiny objects, so many squirrels, that I want to do all the things. So even if you don't have this, then you maybe this isn't relevant, or maybe it is, but do not get distracted by all of the cool findings. Focus on your research question. Add a note, put it somewhere else, but focus on your research questions. Now, again, there might be a place to expand on them, right? To think about it, depending on how specific your research questions are. Qualitative, I usually leave mine a bit more open. But, make sure that you're focused on, for example, in mine, frequency of strategies is interesting. Like all of them use communication, but my research questions are really more about variation. So when I'm looking at frequency, I'm like, oh, great, everyone, because we're trying to make this survey able to distinguish between how people respond. Okay, so 100 people put this one, that's fine, I'll put it in there. I need to know the other options that are available and how other people respond. Okay, so the big challenges with the coding is adding the new codes. Like I said, Again, using that placeholder, other. The IRR levels, again, you don't have to do all at once. If somebody is less experienced or not comfortable, really breaking those apart will save you some trouble in the long run. And then you want to be careful not to inflate your IRR with none. So you really should be, when you're doing IRR, I said I wouldn't talk about it and I haven't stopped, we really should be doing the iterator, going back to my data, the iterator on this code and on this code. Because here, look how, there is no purple. 100% IRR. Yeah, because it's all none. Like, okay, that's not informative. So that's what happens sometimes is some of these obvious codes inflate. So you really want to be careful with your iterator. And I've gotten a lot of pushback because I didn't do this in the beginning. Learn through my mistakes. I've got plenty of them. And so I think that might be, so, and here's an example, by the way, of I haven't shown it to you, of like how to code the regulations. So this is from that published paper. It's just that this is the Word version. So step 5, some background. What does the code book say? The table. There's some examples in there. So anybody that's interested in this very specific thing. So let's pause for questions. Yes.
What would you say is like too many codes? Like,
You're asking the wrong person for too many codes. I think again, too many codes for what? Right, at once?
You're interviewing like 3 people.
What is your theoretical framework? And yeah, exactly. So I think to me, it's, I think it's more about the quantity or it's less about the quantity and more about the quality. Because if you're saying like, if one of your codes is like school, they talked about their school, so you tag it, and that's more of a tag than a code, and that's a whole other thing. And then you have another code for like high school, like, it's kind of like, is that informative? Because sometimes too, with the analysis, which we'll talk about next month, from your codes, part of your analysis might be breaking down those codes further, and looking at the qualitative differences and how different people talked about different things, right? So that's one of the things we'll do in here is, so there was a lot of codes of like, we'll talk about it with the group, but how they're talking about it with their group of like, that I would do this with the group versus we as a group should do something that shows me some different things, right? So do I need to add an I and we code? Is this something to do at the end? Yeah, I'm bad. Yeah, you're pulling some quantitative stuff on me with numbers. I won't have it. No, it's hard. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
So if you notice other cool things that potentially aren't relevant to your research question, is it appropriate? I know in like quantitative research, there's like secondary analysis. Can you do like a qualitative secondary analysis where you look at that data through a new lens? And
can you? Yeah. So and again, it depends, right? It depends on how close those are, because sometimes those other things, like I've used these findings that don't seem relevant as future hypotheses to test, that they're related, but I didn't see enough of them. And maybe it's because of the questions and say future researchers need to consider this. Or, if you saw something that prevalent that you would want to study it again, there might be a bigger question of like, why wasn't it in your, like, it's just hard to imagine it wasn't like adjacent, or it shouldn't be included in your analysis. Like if it's that prevalent that it doesn't fit under your exact questions, I don't know. It's just hard to, I'm not making any sense based on your facial expressions.
no, I was just thinking of an example like from a
Yeah.
previous like
Give me-
research team where they basically did an analysis of a certain like opioid agonist
Yeah.
treatment program. And they were looking at like certain things about how that program is delivered, but then they noticed that a lot of people started talking about like disability and accessibility that wasn't originally part of their research.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I see now. Okay,
and so my understanding is they actually did do like a secondary qualitative analysis and like published another manuscript.
Yes, okay.
Looking like specifically at like disability and accessibility in that context. I just don't know if that's common, is that good practice?
Yeah, I've actually done some of those. I think, so I always say, I could show you all a video and of the same video and say code. And based off of every single one of your backgrounds, your interests, your experiences, you would be looking for something different. So one that I did, it was about how they engaged in discourse, but then I coded for social regulation behaviors. Same data, but we were looking for very different things. Now, there is something of overusing data, right? You don't want to say like, oh, I did this study on drugs and this study on non-prescribed drugs. And like, you know what I mean? Like, and there's just this huge overlap. That was a horrible example, but it's what I got. So that's where it gets a little tricky, that yes, especially when it depends on the data, right? So on where I'm doing a survey and I'm like, answer this question, it's not likely for me to get something completely off the wall. But when you're videotaping students learning unsupervised, God only knows. And I've seen some stuff, right? Like, so it's very possible that your questions are about how they understand math and do that. But then, you know, and you might see some social stuff related to that, or you might see a completely different social stuff that needs to be a second study completely. So yes, the answer, yes, you can do that. Yeah. I think, though, you are supposed to submit an REB even for secondary data analyses, but I'm not sure. Check. It depends. Some schools I've been at say yes, some, it depends. So if you're not sure, always ask. Permission, not forgiveness. Okay, so we don't have much longer, and I probably will turn off the recording soon, but what I have is, I told you I taught this kind of online qualitative course a couple years ago, and I created this for them, and y'all get to benefit from it. So if you want some practice, I know some of you are like, I have my own, I'm doing my own thing, thanks. But this is a organized data for you. So this will take you to this right here. This shared, if you do not have access to it, please let me know. You don't have access to the link to get you that yet, so let me know in the future. So in here is, this is from, and I forget what it is, this is a video. So going back to your question of like, is there data online? There is some data of students, like, please don't put your just videos online without, but here is a student of working, a teacher and student, and again, this one comes with a transcript, and there's also an overview and some resources of all these different things. Well, look how nice I am. I actually created a template. Thanks, Nikki, you're so welcome. So on here, you'll see so what I did, I've cleaned the data, because transcript data is always a mess. Oh yeah, let's see. So here's the timestamp I put in the speaker, which was not, so you'll see this is the whole process. So I went in and put the speaker, and then the teacher notes. So this came from one of these resources, lesson plan, researcher comments and teacher comments. So this took some work. Oh, and I even linked, did I link it in there? Oh, look at that, you're the greatest. And so I did this transcript. And so this is the transcript from the class. I don't know if I can emphasize this enough. The fact that you can see this video and have this date, like, is very hard to find. Most researcher videos like this aren't online because of REB restrictions and consent and that kind of stuff, but you can find them every once in a while, and they're really great practice if you're like, I don't know where to get data. And so then back here, again, the transcript plus, so I added all that information. And so then there are two frameworks that we were discussing in her class, which her class was mostly, I think, like teachers, like practicing teachers, which is why we did the pivotal teacher moments framework. And so again, before you start coding, you should know all about it. Or there's the classroom practices model, again, read. And so then on the bottom here, there are a code book of the pivotal teaching moments. So pivotal teaching moments, how they respond, and then how the student responds to the teacher. And so here's the definition and examples. So this is the code book that I created from those readings. Okay. And so here's where they practice coding, or where you can practice coding, just make a copy. And so here, what pivotal, this goes under your desk, Jared. That is not a pivotal teacher moment, so we put NA. So the procedure is every line we're going to get coded something. Now, if this is NA, then that's NA, and that's NA. And then I put my notes of like, I don't know about this, or, ooh, this is really interesting, or that's not interesting. And so again, you just can practice, do. And then here is the iterator form, maybe. Yep, so coder 1 will copy and paste their codes here, 2 here, and then this is set up to do that equals exact. So for example, if I was like, oh no, I think this is something, I don't know, it'll change this to false. Give me 1 second. And so then these are the reconciled. So we decided that, and we decided not to, this didn't make any sense. So I don't like to change these over here. I like to change, so these are the final reconciled codes. Or you can do with the other classroom practices. So here's an example. Thank you, Pass Nikki. That very rarely happens. I thank her. She's the worst. But this is open. Again, I just ask, I think I made it that it's only view, but to make a copy, again, I'm going to put my slides online, and then you have all the links to click and to get you here. Oh, look at that. Notes, I'm on fire. Of 1, watch the video, make yourself a copy, look over the transcript, actually like read the notes and what's happening, add your own, right? Because those are based off of theirs, but you can add in your own notes of like, here the teacher is talking to the whole class, or the teacher is talking to one student, because maybe that's interesting. And then I go into et cetera, et cetera. So here's a nice little, instead of, if you don't have your own data, but you're like, I want to practice coding, I did all the hard stuff for you, all the cleaning. Pass, Nikki. Don't thank me. Yeah, thanks. Question in the back?
I just wondered if the iterator process was not blinded, like they're doing all in the same.
Oh, good question. Fantastic question, actually. Is the iterator, yes. So how this would work is I would do mine, I would make a copy, and this would be called Coding Practice Nikki. And Jessica would make a copy, and it would be Coding Practice Jessica. And then when we come together, I can send her mine, or she can send me hers. This could be in a completely different document, whatever, but you're 100%. Now, technically, I guess you could do the honor system, but it's very tempting, right? To just be like, yeah. So again, it's that level of like rigor, right? It's just too tempting. This one. So, and I think I even put the like validation stuff here of like what you want to do for the, or not. I don't know what that is. Another question. online questions? Oh, I do have some questions in the chat. Or maybe comments.
Lots of this is amazing, thank you.
Oh, yeah, so all the links will be in the slides after I fix all the typos. I will put those on my website. I will clean up this video. I like to put that. So if you go to, if you can spell it, that's where it gets tough. That's me. It'll be resources. The videos will be in the YouTube channel. And then the materials will be here in winter. I'm just over 2. Look at that. Winter 2023. So I got the winter right, but not the, again, that's about right. And so here's the one from last week or last time. And so that's where all those things are. Any other questions? I'll go ahead and stop the video, but feel free to keep asking questions. I'm going to try to stop the video and find my mouse.